O Brasil é a nossa fonte de inspiração. E os brasileiros, os grandes personagens das histórias que contamos todos os dias, de todos os cantos do país. Existimos para transformar realidades, para ajudar a fazer as perguntas certas com inteligência e distribuir conteúdo de alto nível. Vamos além das notícias. Cobrimos, reverberamos. Tudo para chegar na intimidade de cada história. Histórias que nos revelam, nos aproximam e nos mudam. Investigamos acontecimentos relevantes com detalhamento. Analisamos as diversas faces que compõem todo e qualquer fato. Alcance com profundidade e responsabilidade. Como fazemos? Com diálogo, informação e opinião forte, respeitando a de cada um, refletindo a diversidade que nos faz brasileiros. Somos um canal de troca e interatividade. Saber primeiro, entender melhor, criar juntos conteúdo para todas as audiências. Nosso propósito é fortalecer a sociedade democrática com jornalismo confiável. Acreditamos na interdependência da sociedade e das instituições. Ajudamos a transformar o Brasil porque nossas histórias mexem com as pessoas. E não é isso que fazem as boas histórias? Somos agentes de mudança e mudamos junto com o país que traduzimos. Inovação é cotidiana. Estamos todos conectados. Somos Brasil. Somos o nosso ontem, o hoje. E estamos comprometidos com o nosso amanhã. Somos Globo.
O escritório surgiu no final de 1970. Basicamente, eu fiz um arranjo com o escritório existente, onde eles me cederam uma sala, mas desde o início eu criei minha própria prática. Evidentemente, nós temos um cuidado muito grande com todas as questões que são dadas ao escritório. A gente procura atender sempre um sentimento de empatia. A gente tem que sempre se colocar no lugar do cliente para entender as necessidades dele, mas ao mesmo tempo a gente procura ter uma visão de como aquela questão pode influenciar positivamente o cliente no desenvolvimento dos negócios.
Desde o início, né, e isso permaneceu por todos esses anos, foi sempre a nossa preocupação com qualidade de trabalho, com rapidez para atendimento de cliente e com incentivo aí para inovação. Isso não mudou. Então, assim, as condições de trabalho mudaram muito, mas esses valores sempre permaneceram durante todos esses anos.
Nós fizemos mais de 400 arrendamentos de grandes aviões e durante muitos anos nós éramos os únicos no mercado que fazíamos essa operação. A privatização foi também um grande propulsor do nosso escritório. Nós acabamos fazendo privatizações enormes, como a do Banespa, que foi vendido para o Banco Santander.
E aí a recuperação judicial, isso daí começou a se desenvolver aí pelo Thomas no início dos anos 2000. Grande sucesso e até hoje o escritório é uma referência, né, e muitíssimo reconhecido tanto nacional como internacionalmente.
Sempre que surgem assim, essas questões mais, digamos, desafiadoras, que são uma novidade, nós temos uma queda por isso, e o escritório, ele, de certa forma, ele atua dessa forma, ou seja, nós não recuamos diante de desafios.
Há 13 anos atrás, nós tínhamos duas áreas só, uma área de óleo e gás para atender a demanda do boom que tinha no Rio de Janeiro e um contencioso civil que nada mais era do que uma extensão do escritório de São Paulo. Hoje em dia, nós temos um escritório bem montado, passamos a ser um player importante aqui.
Nós queríamos que, além de um escritório de negócios, ele fosse um escritório de contencioso e fosse reconhecido enquanto tal. Nós investimos, acima de tudo, na formação de um time com expertise técnica, com qualidades, e hoje eu estou absolutamente seguro que nós atingimos essa finalidade.
Eu sempre vi o escritório, na minha área, fazendo o que a gente chama do creme de la creme, né? Que é aquilo que tem de melhor, que envolvia, inclusive, um contencioso societário, questões envolvendo arbitragem e também o desafio da recuperação judicial, que era uma área extremamente nova, a gente estava falando em 2006.
O escritório é reconhecido por ser um escritório full service, é um escritório que atende a todas as áreas, com profissionais altamente especializados nas mais diferentes práticas do direito.
Isso, de uma certa forma, acaba fidelizando o cliente, né?
Hoje o escritório é reconhecido na área ambiental nos principais rankings, não só brasileiros como internacionais.
Nós Atuamos em negócios de infraestrutura cada vez mais fortes, atuando desde as startups até grandes gestores de ativos.
Dentro da infraestrutura e, na verdade, no business como um todo, se tem muito a noção hoje que um negócio ele não tem que apenas ser lucrativo, ele precisa ser correto. E isso perpassa pela governança, perpassa pela integridade e também por soluções que social e ambientalmente sejam corretas. E nós temos o prazer de ver e auxiliar os clientes nisso.
O escritório atua em várias frentes pro bono, então apoiando e assessorando entidades que não conseguem fazer frente, né, ao aporte de recursos para ter uma consultoria desse porte como do escritório.
Apesar de ser um escritório de grande tradição, com 50 anos de existência, é um escritório muito moderno, muito dinâmico, que se transforma a cada dia.
Atualmente, o escritório trabalha para muitos clientes internacionais que são considerados startups. Então, é uma forma muito interessante de conciliar um pouco da nossa experiência do passado com aquilo que é o presente e, na verdade, o futuro.
Desafios não nos incomodam. Muito ao contrário. Nós temos profundo prazer nos desafios, porque através deles nós conseguimos nos transformar, nos reinventar e nos aperfeiçoar.
Boa tarde, bem-vindos a mais uma live do Valor. Esta é uma live especial, um webinar, onde vamos tratar de um assunto novo para a economia brasileira, que traz uma série de convidados especiais. Em nome do Valor Econômico e do escritório Felsberg Advogados, eu agradeço a todos por estarem conectados a esta live e hoje vamos falar sobre realmente um tema muito novo, vamos falar sobre Special Purpose Acquisition Company. É uma forma de financiar a retomada da economia e nós vamos, na verdade, uma forma de financiar a retomada da economia. Nós vamos tratar aqui da experiência americana, como os americanos têm feito para fazer isso, qual a experiência que eles estão usando neste momento. A retomada econômica tem demonstrado que inúmeros projetos podem se beneficiar de investimentos formatados através de SPACs, que é essa nova sigla. A gente conhece aqui no Brasil a Sociedade de Propósito Específico. Esta é um pouco mais sofisticada, ela vai além das SPS. As SPACs aliam tanto a abertura de capital, através de, por exemplo, de bolsas como a Nasdaq, como a injeção de novos recursos e a reestruturação das empresas. Para fazer a abertura oficial deste evento, eu convido o sócio fundador da Felsberg Advogados e referência mundial na área de infalência e na área de recuperação de empresas. O Felsberg é reconhecido por publicações como Latin Lawyer, Chambers and Partners, The Legal 500 and Leaders League, como um dos advogados líderes de insolvência no Brasil. Participou dos comitês responsáveis pela elaboração da atual lei de falências e de recuperação das empresas, conhecido como RJ. Por favor, com a palavra, Dr. Thomas Benes Felsberg.
Muito obrigado, Cristiano, pela apresentação. E é uma grande satisfação estar aqui. Nós estamos aqui numa data muito importante para nós, porque a nossa prática jurídica está festejando 50 anos de vida, 50 anos de montanha-russa nesse Brasil, em que as coisas vão para cima e vão para baixo, vão para o lado, e, graças a Deus, as coisas têm caminhado e o escritório tem crescido e está cada vez mais sólido e cada vez mais bem implantado em nosso país. O nosso lema é olhar presente com visão de futuro. E muitas vezes os jovens me perguntam, o que quer dizer isso? Esse negócio de olhar presente com visão de futuro. São palavras assim, vãs ou têm um significado mais importante? Eu digo, olha, é muito importante, porque, veja, o olhar presente significa que a gente tem que cuidar com muita atenção, com muito cuidado de todos os casos que nos são submetidos. A visão do futuro é que não pode parar aí, a gente precisa saber as consequências a curto prazo, médio prazo, longo prazo das empresas. Ou seja, é preciso ter uma visão também das consequências das soluções e dos riscos que nós analisamos dentro da área jurídica para que as pessoas que nós assistimos, as empresas que nós assistimos, possam realmente tomar a melhor decisão possível no contexto em que esses assuntos são apresentados. Mesmo para o nosso escritório, esse negócio de olhar presente com visão de futuro é uma característica, né? Nós fomos pioneiros do leasing financeiro. Fizemos a primeira operação de leasing internacional de aeronaves. Depois fizemos 400 operações de arrendamento mercantil de aeronaves. A mesma coisa aconteceu com o Project Finance. Nós fizemos uma pequena operação de Project Finance, imaginem, uma madeireira no Amazonas, as quais seguiram 35 Project Finance importantíssimos. Normalmente, os nossos clientes eram o BID ou PIC lá dos Estados Unidos, e nós fizemos termoelétricas, hidrelétricas, metrô, portos, ou seja, o cuidado que nós dedicamos ao assunto presente se projetou para o futuro. Isso aconteceu com as privatizações, onde nós entramos e acabamos fazendo a privatização do Banespa, por exemplo, quando foi vendido para o Santander. É o que aconteceu também nessa área de insolvência, em que o primeiro mandato era para assistir o Banco Mundial, que está fazendo trabalho para o Banco Central para mudar a lei de falências e de recuperação de empresas, tendo em vista uma melhor recuperação de créditos. Esse grupo de trabalho, então, acabou se transformando na Lei 11.101, e hoje nós temos no nosso currículo mais de 120 recuperações judiciais, como advogados dos devedores, ou dos credores, ou dos investidores, e normalmente os maiores casos que nós tivemos nesse país. Então, essa visão do futuro, para nós, tem um significado muito grande, porque é como nós olhamos os casos que os clientes pedem que nós possamos ajudá-los e assisti-los nos casos, mas é também uma norma que nós levamos no escritório. É isso que eu explico para os advogados mais jovens. Do nosso escritório, de outros escritórios, é a contribuição que eu posso dar. Vamos olhar também o presente, o curto prazo, o médio prazo e o longo prazo. Eu tenho dedicado ultimamente a uma questão que eu acho fundamental no Brasil, é como é que nós vamos financiar a retomada econômica. E eu faço parte de um grupo de profissionais de 8 países que estão analisando as experiências internacionais nos diversos países, de como isso pode ser feito, porque o segredo não é doar recurso, o segredo é aplicar recursos que possam depois voltar. Ou seja, não está se falando aí de aumentar a dívida, digamos, o passivo fiscal nem do governo, nem das instituições oficiais, e muito menos de instituições privadas. Mas quais são os mecanismos que existem para que essas aplicações de recursos retornem efetivamente e hajam essa mágica que o Cristiano mencionou, de aliar a abertura de capital, o M&A e também a reestruturação, muitas vezes, do passivo. Esse é o objetivo. E nós convidamos 2 profissionais dos Estados Unidos, que serão apresentados pelos moderadores. Eu só queria dizer o seguinte, para aqueles que não estão muito acostumados com o mercado de capitais e com assuntos financeiros, essas apresentações poderão ser um pouco difíceis de entender. Mas, graças a Deus, nós temos o Ricardo Lacerda conosco, que irá nos explicar, e eu mesmo vou fazer uma breve introdução do assunto aqui no Brasil para tornar isso mais palatável para os nossos ouvintes brasileiros que não são especializados em finanças ou mercado de capitais. Para aqueles que são, vai ser um prato cheio, porque é uma modalidade extremamente interessante que, de repente, nesse momento que nós falamos, há 155 SPACs nos Estados Unidos olhando para oportunidades de investir em empresas. E só nesse ano de 2020, essas cifras já atingiram mais de 50 bilhões de dólares, ou seja, é uma modalidade que realmente está bastante em voga, e então eu agradeço a atenção e gostaria de passar a palavra para os nossos moderadores para apresentar o painel que nos irá explicar e nos instruir a respeito de um assunto tão fascinante.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Thomas. Geralmente, os americanos se expressam de maneira muito clara e objetiva. É mais fácil entender um PhD em economia americano do que um PhD em economia brasileiro. Os dois tendo estudado na mesma escola. Nós vamos chamar aqui, então, os convidados vão fazer uma apresentação, uma curta apresentação, e depois vamos conduzir um painel. O painel será todo conduzido em inglês. Haverá tradução, mas, enfim, respeito aos nossos convidados, nós faremos em inglês. O nosso primeiro panelista é o Rick Lacker, que é Managing Director da Houlihan Lokey. Ele tem BBA em Contabilidade e GDA pela Universidade do Texas, onde foi Chancellor e licenciado como advogado e contador público certificado. Ele tem mais de 3 décadas de experiência. Eu tenho um pouquinho menos de jornalismo, 30 anos. E ele tem uma experiência, enfim, longa, aconselhando clientes públicos e privados em fusões, aquisições e atividades de levantamento de capital. Por favor, Lacker, você tem a palavra. Mr. Lacker, you have the room.
Okay, well, I'm going to set my timer so I don't go over. Thank you so very much. I'm going to walk through a deck very quickly and give you an overview of SPACs and some of the terms and some of the important features. SPACs, a Special Purpose Acquisition Corporation, or also known as a blank check company, is a publicly traded investment vehicle that raises funds through an IPO to buy a company. They typically issue units in connection with an IPO that will consist of a share of stock and a partial unit. Today it's about a half to a third. And those proceeds are held in trust and cannot be accessed by the SPAC until there is a successful transaction. Thus, SPACs have no commercial operations at all until they can complete a merger with a target company. Why do investors invest in SPACs? Well, it's an opportunity for an investor to invest with a seasoned management team. It can be a group of executives. It can be a private equity firm. Many different reasons, but probably the most compelling economic reason is the way SPACs are structured today is you can get your money back. You have a right to redeem at the time that a transaction is presented to the investors, and you can vote yes, but you can get your money back and you can keep your warrant. So you basically have a risk-free investment with upside behind a management team. Let's turn to page 2. Page 3, and we're going to talk about what's in it. Promote, and it really turns out to be 25% of the IPO proceeds. So when you add the two together, if it's $100 million, they get 20%, but that would be 25 because 25 is 20% of 125. And what they do is they front all the expenses because they have to pay for everything until a transaction closes. We'll talk a little bit about the warrants that are part of the unit. A warrant will typically be priced at a 15% premium. The typical IPO price is $10 a share. The warrant would be exercisable at $1.50. It would be a 5-year warrant, and it would be forced exercised if it ever hit 80% appreciation or $18 a share. There are 3 primary considerations that you think about when you're trying to complete a SPAC. First and foremost is, do they have the money? And so you have to have money to pay any kind of cash payment to the sellers or the SPAC candidate. You have to pay expenses. You have to pay for redemptions. As we talked about, a SPAC investor has the right to put their shares, sorry about that, to put their shares, I have no idea what happened. I apologize there. They have the right to put their shares back to the company. So you have to have enough cash. Cash normally comes from the IPO proceeds. The sponsors will generally put an amount of money called a forward purchase agreement that would enable them to purchase more shares. It tends to be a nominal amount relative to the size of the IPO. In addition, you see certain sponsors. There was a large SPAC formed called Pershing Square. That is, the sponsor of that is a guy named Bill Ackman, who is a well-known U.S. activist. His is a $4 billion SPAC, and he has a purchase commitment of $1 to $3 billion. You also see something called a backstop. There is a family of SPACs called CC Newberger. The main person behind that is Chin Chu, a seasoned Blackstone executive, and they are backed by the Koch family, a well-known industrial, not the drink, family that's based in the U.S., but the family wealth is about $100 billion. They put $300 million of capital behind that SPAC. But the most common way a SPAC raises money to complete a transaction, in addition to the IPO, is known as a PIPE, a public investment in a private business, but it's going to be public. So basically, they don't buy these shares on the public exchange, they buy it ahead of time. So what happens in a typical transaction, a SPAC will identify a target, they will start having discussions, they'll enter into a letter of intent, at which time they'll complete their diligence, and while they're working on a definitive agreement, typically the underwriter of the SPAC will go out and approach institutional investors and ask them to invest in the company. They will buy common stock. They will buy common stock at $10 a share, but they do not get warrants. Another consideration is, can you get a shareholder vote? In the old rendition of SPACs, go back 5, 6, 7 years, the shareholder vote was a big issue. Today, because of this right to redeem, you can always get your shareholder vote. Finally, the last primary consideration is valuation. Can you make everybody happy? Can you make the target shareholder happy? Can you make the SPAC and the sponsor happy? Can you make the public investors happy? And can you make the PIPE investors happy? If you turn to page 5, I'm going to quickly walk you through an example of a SPAC transaction and how all the different pieces work. Let's assume we have a company that has $75 million of EBITDA and would be valued at 15 times are a value of $1.125 billion. That's in the upper left hand. And so let's assume that they're going to get $125 million of cash. And so what that means, they have $1 billion of value left over. That means they would get 100 shares, 100 million shares. In our example, we have a $200 million SPAC. I'm up on the upper right-hand side, and I have a PIPE of 200 million. So that's another 20 million shares each. And then the sponsor promote, which they paid nothing for, is 5 million shares. So all told, this SPAC would have 145 million shares. At $10 a share, that's $1.45 billion. So now if you go to the left-hand page, and to highlight a point is we have a SPAC with a trading value of 1.45, of which $250 million is cash. So that means that the value of the company has gone from $1.125 to $1.2 billion. And the difference is the sponsor promote that $50 million and $25 million of expenses. And that 15 times valuation multiple, if you look at the bottom of the page, now has to go to 16.7. So you have all of these moving pieces to make sure that everybody is going to be happy and the company can trade. What are the characteristics? I'm on to page 6, and if someone will flash how much time I have, I can act accordingly. If you think about what makes a SPAC a good target, first of all, it has to be big enough to be relevant in the equity market. Second, it's going to have attractive business characteristics in a sector. Tech is hot right now. It can be something green tech, what we'd call, or energy tech. You see a lot of battery companies or auto automation companies. You see gaming tech. So those seem to be, fancied in the marketplace. You can do a well-known name. The SPAC I mentioned, the Pershing Square SPAC, was rumored to be talking to Airbnb about a transaction. You can have a business that would have attractive growth. Maybe it's a company like in the example, not a pre-revenue company as some of these other technology companies are. Or it can be something that has stability and it's more of a value play, although those types of companies seem to be falling out of favor. You need a strong management team, and when augmented by the SPAC team, they're able to sell the story to the marketplace and deliver future performance and convince the investors they can do so. You need to meet the accounting internal control requirements of being a US listed public company. And as that map showed on the prior page with respect to the promote, you need to be big enough so that promote becomes a rounding error, because the sponsors want to keep, in our case, the 50 million. What are some of the trends that are developing? I'm on page 7 now. We're seeing SPACs getting larger. The one I mentioned, the Pershing Square, is 4 billion. We're now seeing SPACs in excess of 500 million on a regular basis. Although in the last several weeks, we are seeing actually SPACs downsize a little bit, just because it's harder to find bigger and bigger companies. The warrants, that go back several years, it was 1 share, 1 warrant. And now you're seeing 1 share, a half a warrant, a third a warrant, and sometimes even a quarter of a warrant. And you're actually seeing transactions that don't have warrants in them. As I mentioned, people tend to forget about the warrants when you're doing the transaction, but they are going to be dilutive over time. I had mentioned that the typical SPAC, you cannot touch the trust. There has been a SPAC filed by what we call a serial issuer, Churchill. They are now taking up to 10% of the proceeds for expenses. They're not finished their IPO, so we'll see if the market will take that. And finally, there are some SPACs, the Pershing Square being one of them, that are moving away from the promote structure, which is a dilutive structure. Going on to the next page, when you think about a transaction, a lot of people think it could be an M&A transaction, but it's really more akin to a financing or going public. So what you're looking at is, am I a viable public company? What is the execution risk of getting a transaction done? In general, compared to an M&A transaction, there is much more execution risk, both in terms of having to sign an LOI early in the process and picking your partner, and whether or not that partner can raise the necessary cash. Moving to page 9. The SPAC market has exploded. Year to date, and it says 139 SPACs in the several days since we put these materials together, it's now 147 SPACs have gone public this year, raising $56 billion, compared to 59 SPACs last year, raising $14 billion. There are 160 SPACs today looking for transactions. Turning to page 10 is just a list of select serial issuers, as these sponsors can make anywhere between $50 and $100 million a transaction. They have an incentive to go do this as often as they can. On page 11, I'm not going to cover it, but one interesting note on the Skillsoft with transaction is Skillsoft filed for bankruptcy in June, emerged from bankruptcy in August, and announced a SPAC transaction and a concurrent acquisition in October. That deal will probably take about 3 or 4 months to get done. An interesting SPAC, HPX, we're on page 12, is focused on the Brazilian market. They initially raised 220, and there is a IPO feature called an over-allotment option, which allows the underwriters to sell more shares. So they have $253 million, and they're looking for more than likely $1 billion plus transaction in the Brazilian market. And finally, to wrap up, what is sort of the long-term outlook for SPACs? I think the jury is out. In terms of market performance, over the last year, if you look at SPACs that have completed a transaction over the last year, the performance has not been that good, that they have badly underperformed the regular IPO market. And there appears to be a difference between those SPACs formed by operating executives and those formed by financial folks. There are a handful of SPACs that have done very, very well this year, and with as much money out there, there are going to be a lot of transactions to come, and this will be an asset class that will be out there for a long time, albeit probably not at the level of frothiness it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lacker. Nosso próximo convidado é outro americano, Lee Rockbaum Davis Polk. Eu espero que eu esteja pronunciando o nome dele corretamente. Mr. Rockbaum é sócio do departamento corporativo da Davis Polk, ele atua nos grupos de private equity, né, que todos aqui no Brasil conhecemos como participações acionárias, embora a imprensa sempre use o termo em inglês, fusões e aquisições e gestão de investimentos. Ele normalmente representa patrocinadores desses fundos de private equity e outros fundos privados, em uma ampla gama de transações e temas incluindo formação de fundos, aquisições e alienações de empresas, e questões também relativas a portfólio da empresa. Mr. Rockbaum, please, you have the room.
Thank you, Cristiano. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about SPAC transactions from the perspective of the private company that may be considering a potential transaction with a SPAC, as well as provide some context regarding the U.S. legal framework that applies to SPAC transactions. And maybe if whoever's controlling the deck could actually skip ahead to page 5, maybe I'll start there. So look, Rick already touched on kind of the types of private companies that SPACs often target. They need to be, attractive businesses that are IPO or public company ready in terms of their internal controls and financial reporting. They can be in any number of sectors, although there are certain sectors, including automation and certain technology, that are particularly hot at this moment. But fundamentally, when we're talking about private companies that are potential SPAC candidates, it is a company that is IPO ready and is attractive to the public markets in the U.S., both for existing SPAC investors and for potential future SPAC investors. Historically, most SPAC targets have been standalone companies and have been U.S. companies, not surprisingly, because SPACs are largely, at least of current, a U.S. phenomena. But given the surge in activity in SPACs over the past 12 or 24 months, we're actually seeing a wider net being cast by SPACs. Instead of looking just to standalone operating companies, we're seeing SPACs pursue targets that are often carve-out businesses from existing larger enterprises. Rick mentioned earlier the Skillsoft transaction, which was a company that had recently emerged from bankruptcy, not historically a SPAC target of choice, but it'll be interesting to see if that opens up the door to future similar SPAC transactions. And also SPACs have the ability to acquire kind of pools of assets, separate and apart from a standalone operating business, although that adds additional complexity. In addition, while again, most SPAC targets historically have been U.S. companies, there's no reason why that has to be the case, and there are in fact SPACs that have acquired foreign targets, including in Latin America. Betterware is a Mexican company that went public via SPAC in the last 12 months. And as Rick noted, there are various SPACs, including HPX, that are specifically targeting non-US target companies. The challenge, obviously, is that the target company or business needs to be one that is attractive and can be marketed and sold to US investors. So certainly, U.S. investors are open to the possibility of investing in non-U.S. companies, but they will expect, that the company be of a level of sophistication, and that the information provided by the company be of a level similar to what you would see from a U.S. issuer. And one point of note, actually, non-U.S. companies offer certain strategic advantages to deal execution relative to U.S. companies. Most non-U.S. companies that may be considered when partnering with a SPAC will qualify as foreign private issuers under the U.S. listing rules, which results in reduced financial statement and other disclosure requirements, similar to what would apply in the case of a standalone IPO. So that's the general kind of look at what types of companies or businesses may be attractive candidates to SPACs. The question remains, for a company that is approached by or considering a transaction with a SPAC, weighing the alternatives, what are the benefits and potential considerations in combining with a SPAC relative to a traditional IPO in the US markets or a standalone M&A transaction. And actually, if whoever's controlling the slides could go to the next page. So at a high level, most often, while SPAC involves an M&A component, as Rick noted earlier, the real point of comparison is probably less an M&A transaction, which is a change of control, but more an IPO, which is a public listing event. And an IPO, traditional IPO, and a SPAC merger both offer private companies and a path to a U.S. listing. which offers certain benefits, including the ability to trade in the U.S. public markets, which offers enhanced liquidity to existing investors and the potential to bring in new investors. SPACs also offer the ability to raise capital, both primary proceeds for growth and operating capital, often via the form of the PIPE, as well as the possibility for existing owners to monetize a portion of their holdings via a secondary component. So in a SPAC transaction, the SPAC brings to the table the trust proceeds and often the cash proceeds from a PIPE fundraise, and that those funds, net of redemptions, go either to the balance sheet of the company to fund future growth and operations, and or to the existing selling shareholders. And relative to a traditional IPO, I think the monetization of existing shareholders cashing out is a little bit more accepted in a SPAC, whereas in a traditional IPO, there's a little bit of market practice and convention that disfavors secondary transactions as opposed to pure primary IPOs. When a company is weighing a SPAC, going public via SPAC, via a traditional IPO or alternative, it's important to consider kind of the advantages and disadvantages. Rick hit on many of them, but I'd like to spend a little more time kind of in depth from the perspective of the private operating business as to why a SPAC may or may not be an attractive path for them to pursue. So one of the key factors and benefits of a SPAC is it offers private companies an opportunity to de-risk, what we call de-risk, the going public process. And that's important if you think of, the traditional IPO process. You file a public prospectus, you spend some time marketing and raising awareness of the company, and ultimately the company does not price until the very end of the process. And until the very end of the process, you're effectively taking market and valuation risk. And there are certainly plenty of examples where companies have gone through the marketing process and have achieved valuations less than they anticipated. And there have also been high-profile cases. Most recently WeWork late last year, in which a company went through the IPO process and actually was met with significant skepticism by the public markets to the point where they had to withdraw the IPO. So there's a level of risk inherent in any IPO. One of the key features of a SPAC transaction is you're actually de-risking, you're taking some of that risk off the table because you're locking in the initial pricing and valuation on the basis of private negotiations with the SPAC and with the PIPE investors without having to kind of go out to the full market. And if the SPAC and the public and the PIPE investors are not supportive of the valuation you're seeking, you can always, revise the valuation or perhaps, pull the process, again, without having gone through the public scrutiny that is attendant to an IPO process. So that is particularly attractive to in many companies that have concerns about, their ability to successfully execute an IPO. And that is often the case in particular with companies that may not be seen as traditional IPO candidates, either because they're pre-revenue or because they operate in industries where there's not, a lot of natural market comps to point to. Rick mentioned earlier that we're seeing a lot of SPAC activity in the electric car and automated vehicle in industries. And, one of the reasons for that is because, frankly, there's not a lot of great, public market valuation comps for those companies. Tesla exists, but it's a bit of an outlier. And there's a concern that those companies, if they were to go through a traditional public marketing process, there'd be a fair amount of uncertainty as to the valuation they'd achieve. Much safer to do a private negotiation with a SPAC, lock in the valuation, and then present themselves to the market on that basis with the validation and credibility of the SPAC and the PIPE investors. Similar story with Virgin Galactic, which is the private space travel company sponsored by Virgin, led by Richard Branson, then went public via SPAC last year. Not really a clear, path for the public market to value such a company, given there are no other commercial space travel companies, and so therefore a safer path is to link arms with a SPAC and then present a kind of fully valued story. So that's one of the key, considerations for many companies considering IPOing with a SPAC. I touched on already, there's potentially greater willingness or ability to monetize a portion of the existing equity. There's also in SPAC, and I'll turn back to this in a moment, it relates to the disclosure rules. There's also a bit more flexibility in the disclosure rules as they relate to SPACs relative to an IPO process that's underwritten by a U.S. investment bank that is subject to underwriter liability and has its own considerations when considering the disclosure materials. In SPAC transactions, there's greater ability to use forward-looking projections for marketing purposes, which again can be important for companies that are pre-revenue, companies that recently emerged from bankruptcies, or companies that otherwise don't have a historical revenue-producing, EBITDA-producing history to point to. In addition, many companies find it a benefit of SPAC transactions to be able to partner with an existing, credible, sophisticated U.S. SPAC sponsor who lends not just capital, but also kind of name and resources to the public market story. So, going public on your own is one thing, but going public when you're able to partner with a Pershing Square or a Chinchu or an Apollo or GPG or other kind of large-scale U.S. investment firm who's kind of supporting your story and bringing to bear its resources and network to the success of the public market company, that offers another benefit that is attractive to companies that otherwise fear that they may be overlooked by the public markets. And then finally, there's a view that SPAC transactions can often happen a little bit more quickly and with a little bit less of a demand on management time than a traditional IPO. So some people review it as a shortcut to an IPO. I think that's a bit unfair. There's a lot of work that goes into a SPAC transaction, but it is true that there are certain benefits to a SPAC merger that you don't have to go through a traditional IPO roadshow process. There's correspondingly less demands on management time. So those are the benefits. At the same time, you do need to weigh some of the potential downsides, or we call them here considerations, of a SPAC process versus a traditional IPO process. The one that's foremost on most companies' mind is the dilutive impact of the SPAC economics, which means both the founder economics, the 20 or 25% that Rick referred to earlier, as well as the warrant overhang from the IPO. So that is going to be, just as a matter of the pro forma capital table, dilutive of the economic to the selling shareholders, to the public market investors. And that's why one of the key negotiating points in any SPAC transaction and structuring discussions is to limit the dilution, either by sizing the transaction, going after a target company that's big enough so that the dilution is comparatively smaller, or perhaps by coming to an understanding with the sponsor to reduce the amount of the sponsor economics, to buy back some of the warrants in order to reduce the overhang and get the lower the dilution, so it's not going to be a drag on the public market performance. Another consideration is the shareholder base. One of the benefits of going through an IPO process is that you're marketing to long-term shareholders, and there's going to be a natural kind of symmetry between the IPO investors and the long-term shareholders. When you look at a SPAC process, that you're inheriting essentially the shareholders of the SPAC, some of whom may be long-term investors, but who also may include hedge funds, other kind of arbitrageur firms who are looking to park their money in a risk-free investment and then potentially get out via the redemption or by a quick trade, which can result in some choppiness following the SPAC merger process. So one of the important considerations in a SPAC merger is ensuring there's kind of alignment between the shareholder base that is inherited by the company and long-term value-oriented shareholders of the SPAC. And that can be done partly through the PIPE investment, partly through a post-announcement roadshow where you look to replace the shares out of the hands of short-term kind of holders and into the hands of long-term holders. But that is a consideration in a SPAC transaction, the mismatch in the shareholder base, as well as the choppiness and or kind of lack of liquidity in the near term. And hand in hand with that goes, the research coverage that's available to the post-de-SPAC company. In an IPO process, there's always going to be, a fair amount of research coverage, which ensures that there's sufficient information about the IPO company to allow, institutional investors to get comfortable investing. In a SPAC process, it's a little more hit or miss, and it's important to ensure that there's sufficient research analyst coverage in order to ensure long-term liquidity. So those are the considerations, and it should be clear that there's no one-size-fits-all approach for any company. It's really going to be a matter of weighing the pros and the cons. But I do think it is clear that the recent experience has shown that there is a place for SPACs in the kind of public markets, and that SPACs can be a very effective vehicle for taking companies public, particularly companies that face some of the obstacles I touched on earlier, particularly around kind of sector or lack of operating experience. SPACs have proven that they can be a very effective and, if executed and structured properly, successful means of taking public companies that they would otherwise not have access to the public markets. And for that reason, while it's unclear whether the current excitement over SPACs will continue, at least at current levels, I do think that there is a place for SPACs in the public markets going forward. That I would like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the disclosure requirements around SPACs. And Rick touched earlier on the fact that if you look at kind of the long-term trading results of SPACs, they're a bit mixed relative to traditional IPOs. And that has led to some criticism of SPACs, that they're a bit of a shortcut to a public listing. And some people have said that the disclosure provided in connection with SPAC mergers is not on a par with the disclosure in IPOs. And maybe that's resulting in a bit of a kind of a rush to invest in SPACs on the basis of incomplete information. And that may explain the trading results. And I think that's actually not entirely fair. If whoever is controlling the slides could go back a couple of pages to slide 3. If you look at the U.S. disclosure regime that governs SPAC mergers, you'll find that while the form of disclosure document is different, the actual substantive disclosure requirements for a company undergoing a SPAC merger are actually broadly comparable, and in some ways, more extensive than would be the case for a company undergoing a traditional IPO. So the financial statement requirements, and Rick mentioned that financial statement requirements and financial statement readiness are key for any company considering a SPAC merger, because consistent with U.S. IPO requirements, the company will need to present 2 to 3 years of audited financial statements and audited to public company accounting standards. So those are the same financial statement requirements that would apply in a traditional IPO. Similarly, the disclosure document for a SPAC merger is required to include an extensive description of the business, management discussion analysis, risk factors, compensation, and disclosure. Again, broadly comparable, if not more extensive, to what would be included in an IPO. In addition to all that, SPAC disclosure documents often actually include additional disclosure sections relating to the business combination, the events leading up to the business combination, the reasons for the deal, the course of negotiations, projections I touched on earlier. So when the dust settles, if you look at a SPAC disclosure document, it's actually quite substantial and in some ways more significant than an IPO disclosure document. So it's not the case that in a SPAC the public market is less informed, that there's less disclosure than there would be an IPO. If anything, it's the reverse. The disclosure is consistent, if not more extensive than would be in an IPO. Whether the public is appropriately digesting that information and valuing it, obviously you could come to a different view on that. But from a legal framework, it is certainly the case that in terms of disclosure requirements, the SPAC mergers are accompanied by quite extensive disclosure requirements that are comparable to what would be required in a standalone IPO. And with that, I think just a few words on kind of the timeline for a SPAC transaction. And if whoever's controlling the slides could go to the very last slide. I mentioned earlier that one of the perceived benefits of a SPAC process is that it can happen more quickly than an IPO. A typical IPO process, it depends on the company's IPO readiness, but typical rule of thumb is 6 to 12 months from a kickoff to a settlement of the IPO. SPAC process can come together a little bit more quickly than that, typically 3 to 5 months. Although again, that assumes that the company is starting from a baseline of public company readiness. If not, and if there's need to go back and kind of get financial controls and internal accounting controls and financial statements and ready, that can impose additional delays on the front end. But broadly speaking, with the market being as active as it is now, we're seeing SPAC transactions come together quite quickly. Oftentimes there's a marketing process where companies will kind of market themselves through multiple SPACs, often in the competitive auction dynamic. Ultimately, it's typical to negotiate and sign an LOI with a single SPAC, and then it's off to the races to negotiate a merger agreement, go out and sign a PIPE financing, put together marketing materials, and announce to the market. And all that can come together very quickly in a matter of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks to be safe, but as little as 3 to 4 weeks when circumstances dictate. Once the announcement occurs, there's then the SEC filing process kicks in. and the disclosure document gets filed with the SEC, goes through one or more rounds of SEC review. Once it clears SEC review, the SPAC needs to hold a shareholder meeting to hold a shareholder vote, although that's not a significant impediment to transactions now, although the redemption option that occurs in connection with the vote may be. And when all is said and done, you're looking at another, call it, 2.5 to 3.5 months post-announcement. So altogether, SPAC transactions are occurring quite quickly, call it a month to 6 weeks from kickoff to announcement of the deal, another, 2.5 to 3.5 months to closing the deal, 3 to 5 months all in, a bit quicker than you might see for an IPO or an M&A process. One of the benefits of a SPAC is because the SPAC is a shell company, typically the regulatory approvals are fairly easy to come by, relative to what would happen if you were combining two operating companies. That said, certain companies that are in industries that have particular regulatory approval requirements that would introduce delays or local law requirements that would delay the process. That's something that would make the company less attractive to a SPAC, which is looking to move quickly to capitalize on current market dynamics, and is also kind of mindful of the fact that the SPAC itself has a limited runway to complete the transaction. So with that, I think that wraps up the matters I wanted to speak to. So I'll hand it back over to Cristiano.
Thank you, Lee. Bom, eu vou, antes de passar a palavra para o Dr. Thomas Felsberg, eu queria lembrar que estamos aqui também com o Ricardo Lacerda, que é o fundador, principal sócio do Banco de Investimento BR Partners. O Ricardo, que teve, enfim, longa experiência no mercado financeiro, passou pelo Citibank, estudou na prestigiosa Columbia University. Estamos aqui também com a Fabiana Solano, que é sócia do Felsberg Advogados, vai me ajudar depois a conduzir o painel, a parte de debates do painel. Dr. Felsberg, a palavra está com o senhor. Com você.
Muito obrigado, Cristiano. O SPAC, como nós vimos, é uma empresa, digamos que, de início, não tem um objeto social, senão o de procurar uma outra empresa para fazer uma incorporação reversa nela. Ou seja, o objetivo de criar um SPAC é de acumular um capital necessário para poder engajar uma outra operação, que será, então, essa operação que vai envolver abertura de capital, um M&A e também, possivelmente, uma reestruturação de dívida. Aqui no Brasil, evidentemente que os SPACs que foram mencionados até agora pelo Rick e pelo Lee são empresas que foram listadas principalmente no Nasdaq, embora alguns SPACs também são listados no New York Stock Exchange. Mas aqui no Brasil a gente poderia fazer um SPAC brasileiro e registrar na CVM como emissor em fase pré-operacional. E as ações poderiam ser negociadas com e entre investidores qualificados, de acordo com a instrução da CVM 480. Então, basicamente, o objetivo do SPAC é procurar uma empresa que ela possa adquirir. Tá certo? E com esses 3 objetivos que eu mencionei. O capital do SPAC não é trivial. Ele é, desde o início, ele já é subscrito e entregue e integralizado na empresa de início. Mas esse capital, ele fica numa conta bloqueada. Ele só poderá ser utilizado se os investidores concordarem com o negócio apresentado, com a empresa-alvo que for apresentada e nas condições apresentadas. Caso isso não ocorra, esse capital é devolvido para os subscritores com a remuneração, digamos, que eles puderem obter por investimentos de curto prazo. Os sponsors do SPAC, as empresas, as instituições que forem organizar o SPAC, eles normalmente recebem um percentual das ações. E para que isso não signifique uma grande diluição também tanto dos subscritores do SPAC como da empresa-alvo, como dos acionistas da empresa-alvo, então é normal que essas operações, como o Rick bem demonstrou no exemplo dele, sejam bastante grandes. Mas, normalmente, o que tem ocorrido nos Estados Unidos é que, digamos, a compensação por organizar um SPAC, em geral, é 20% do capital do SPAC depois da incorporação, né? Esse é o montante. E, muitas vezes, pelas condições de, digamos, de não aceitação do negócio, de emissão, ou outros negócios feitos para completar o pacote de financiamentos necessários, nos Estados Unidos esse percentual ele pode ser reduzido. Então, a grande maioria dos casos, o sponsor ele acaba com 75% desse valor inicialmente projetado. A empresa adquirida pelo SPAC, ou incorporada dentro do SPAC, ela pode continuar sob o controle dos atuais acionistas. Então, eles terão um reforço de capital, como no IPO normal, e terão novos acionistas, que são os acionistas do SPAC, então, que passarão também a deter capital da empresa incorporada. Como eu disse, essa aquisição pode também ser financiada ou cofinanciada com recursos de terceiros, ou através de um PIPE, né, que é a aquisição privada de empresas com capital aberto, ou de compras futuras. Então, o pacote financeiro ele pode ser bastante completo. O pessoal que resolve subscrever ações do PIPE, eles recebem também um bônus de subscrição, ou seja, eles têm uma vantagem adicional, que é no sentido de ganhar com a valorização das empresas após concluída a operação do SPAC. Esse bônus de subscrição, atualmente nos Estados Unidos, para cada ação subscrita, ele recebe uma meia ação de bônus de subscrição, e o preço de exercício desse bônus de subscrição, em geral, é acima do preço de subscrição das ações do SPAC. Dizendo o seguinte, o ganho adicional que os acionistas do SPAC receberão depois de concluída a operação de incorporação da empresa-alvo, esse ganho de capital, ele permitirá, então, que, por exemplo, se eu subscrevo ações a $10 do SPAC, eu terei um bônus de subscrição a $11,50, como é usual no mercado americano. Então, se essa ação tiver um valor de 20 ou de 30, então isso será um resultado significativo que será obtido para o acionista do SPAC. Isso é uma compensação que o acionista do SPAC recebe por manter bloqueado os recursos dele por um período de tempo, que pode chegar de até 2 anos, né? Procura-se, alguns SPACs tem que fechar em 18 meses, procura-se, como disse o Lee, é possível que essas operações sejam concluídas em 3 ou 5 meses, dependendo da circunstância e digamos, da situação de adequação da empresa para a abertura do capital. Então, se não houver muitas providências a serem tomadas para concluir a operação do SPAC, é possível encurtar esse momento em que o capital fica bloqueado. É interessante notar que, na experiência americana, e há uma apresentação bastante interessante do Rick, que eu espero que a gente possa entregar a todos aqueles que estão nos assistindo, é que o SPAC muda de denominação. Então, vamos supor, eu faço um SPAC para adquirir os Correios aqui no Brasil. Então, aquela empresa que se chamava qualquer coisa, que é o nome fantasia do SPAC, passará a se denominar Correios, a denominação que vier a ser aceita. Aqui no Brasil, a gente, em termos de engenharia societária, há 2 aspectos a considerar, né? O SPAC pode perfeitamente, digamos, incorporar as ações da empresa-alvo. Nesse caso, o SPAC se transforma numa holding e a empresa-alvo se transforma ou permanece como uma empresa operacional. A outra forma é que o SPAC ele abre uma filial aqui no Brasil e essa filial, então, incorpora a empresa-alvo. São duas modalidades que, atualmente, foram facilitadas por duas alterações legislativas importantes aqui no Brasil. O primeiro é que a abertura de filial de empresa estrangeira não mais requer autorização de um decreto presidencial, ou seja, isso pode ser feito no nível mesmo da junta comercial, é possível uma empresa estrangeira abrir uma filial no Brasil. Então, isso facilita também essa construção. Outro fator que é interessante é que, recentemente também, através da resolução resolução CVM 3, de 11 de agosto de 20, é possível também lançar BDRs no mercado brasileiro. O que significa o seguinte: se um SPAC americano ele tiver como empresa-alvo, como existe um cujo objetivo é encontrar empresas no Brasil, uma empresa brasileira, essas ações do SPAC, depois de efetuada a incorporação da empresa-alvo, elas podem ser negociadas no Brasil através de BDRs. Isso também é uma novidade, está aqui há 2 meses só, e 3 meses, 2 meses. Então, são flexibilizações da legislação brasileira que facilitariam a estruturação de SPACs aqui no Brasil. Uma questão importante, perdão. Uma questão importante é que há todo um aspecto contábil de obediência ao GAP dos Estados Unidos e da auditoria necessária para empresas públicas americanas. Então, a empresa-alvo que quiser ser incorporada por um SPAC americano, por exemplo, e não necessariamente alguns SPACs americanos são empresas de outras jurisdições. Então, pode ser um SPAC da Bermuda, mas que é autorizado a operar nos Estados Unidos. Então, nesse caso, as questões contábeis e de auditoria precisam obedecer ao regime das empresas públicas norte-americanas. Então, esse é um sumário que eu queria trazer para vocês, e principalmente para aqueles que não são tão versados na área de mercado de capitais e de finanças, e que alguns termos podem parecer um pouco mais difíceis de serem entendidos. Mas eu gostaria, então, de devolver a palavra aqui aos nossos moderadores para fazer as perguntas e dar início aos debates.
Bom, para quem chegou agora, muito obrigado, doutor Thomas. Para quem chegou agora, nós estamos fazendo um webinar especial, Valor Econômico, junto com o Felsberg Advogados, um webinar sobre o SPAC, uma Special Purpose Acquisition Company, é uma espécie de sociedade de propósito específico, que é um novo instrumento criado nos Estados Unidos para financiar a retomada da economia, na verdade, a retomada econômica através de empresas que passaram por dificuldades. Eu entendi que SPAC é uma espécie de tirar vantagem de uma crise, usar a crise como uma oportunidade. Infelizmente, não teremos mais aqui no nosso debate o Ricardo Lacerda, que, por motivos pessoais, teve que nos abandonar. Eu vou passar a palavra agora. A partir de agora, nós vamos fazer o painel, vai ser todo produzido em inglês. Eu vou passar a palavra para a Fabiana, finalmente, né? Então, Fabiana Solano, we're going to speak English from now on, and Fabiana, you have the room to make the first question.
Thank you, Cristiano. Well, first, I want to thank you all for this presentation that it's been very enlightened and very important for us, especially that we are learning here directly from the source, right, about SPACs. So I'll start addressing my questions to Lee and Rick, both of you. So let me know who feels more comfortable to respond that. But first of all, I wanted to say that I'll take a few questions which will go back to a few points that were partially covered by both presentations, but I wanted to explore them a little bit more, especially for us, because we are not so familiar with the SPACs in Brazil. So I'll ask you to have a little bit more patience with us with respect to SPACs, but let's go there. So first of all, it is clear to me, based on both presentations that you've made, that there is a boom, a clear boom of SPACs in the US lately, right? Which is quite surprising to me, considering its limited track record so far, right? Comparing to other investment solutions in the market. So my question is, why did SPACs become so increasingly popular these days? In other words, who is making money out of SPACs? I understood that there's a lot of people making money out of it, but are people making more out of SPACs than in traditional IPOs and M&As?
Lee, you want me to go first? And then...
Sure, go ahead.
So you hit the nail on the head, is who's making money. And, Wall Street historically has always figured out ways to make money. So a Wall Street firm will get something like 5.5% of the IPO proceeds. Now, the typical IPO would be 7%. It'd be less than that, depending on the size. And, of that, they get paid roughly half up front and half when they get the transaction done. And then in addition, they get fees for placing the pipe, generally 3%. So there is a lot of money to be made by the Wall Street firms. And so that's, in essence, they're very good at when there is money circulating in the system, if they can figure out how to capture that money, redirect it, and get paid for it. And, I think as long as there's an appetite in the investor world, that they will continue to be popular. So it is as simple as you said. Wall Street has figured out this is an attractive fee source for them, and hopefully these transactions over a long period of time will work out well.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of other factors. Look, obviously, as Rick said, follow the money, but there are a couple of other factors that I think also partially contribute to the recent explosion in SPAC activity. One, you're seeing, more sophisticated sponsors behind SPACs. So where historically it was, less well-known names or individuals, you are seeing the blue chip U.S. investment firms behind SPACs. There's a couple reasons for that, but fundamentally, I think they have realized that the SPAC structure provides these firms with access to U.S. public market retail investors, which they would not otherwise have under U.S. marketing rules. Most of these firms otherwise cater only to the private market funds. So this opens up a whole other pool of capital for these firms, and with the kind of increased enthusiasm of sponsors, that has bred kind of more and more, a follow-on effect. The other, factor that I think, has played, some role in what is going on is, the recent, obviously 2020 has been a challenging year globally for the global political and economic markets. And SPACs actually provide a useful product in that circumstance. So for investors, who are looking to park their money in a risk-free investment, the SPAC structure is actually quite attractive. They invest in the IPO, and then worst comes to worst, a year later, they redeem and get their money back. And on the other hand, if the SPAC goes and does a deal and the deal results in a pop in the trading price, then that is even more upside. So the SPAC structure in today's kind of volatile market and a low interest rate environment is particularly attractive to investors. If you went back a few years ago and the market was, different and the interest rates were higher, you might not have seen the current appetite for SPACs. And then finally, there's been some high profile, very successful SPAC transactions. Rick and I mentioned a few of them earlier: Virgin Galactic, Nikola. Kind of come back down to earth a little bit recently, but there has been a bit of a halo effect from some of these high profile transactions that has led to more and more interest in SPACs.
Lee, if you allow me, Christian, I don't know if you want to jump into.
Go on. Okay. Go after.
Yeah. And Lee, why is it essential that the investors or the sponsors, they do not know the target company from the beginning, right? Since the beginning of the process, or prior, at least prior to the investment and the business
Yeah, it's a great question, and frankly, we get this question almost daily. Companies, sponsors, financial sponsors come to us and they say, we have a portfolio company we'd like to take public. We'd like to do it with a SPAC, but instead of paying the sponsor economics to someone else, why don't we just sponsor our own SPAC and use that to take a portfolio company public? The answer is actually quite simple. The reason is the SPAC is a blank check company, and the SEC and the stock exchanges allow these companies to IPO and raise money in the public markets on the basis that they have not identified a target. If a SPAC had actually identified a target prior to IPOing, then it would, not be raising money as a blank check company. It would need to include disclosure in its IPO prospectus regarding the target company under the SEC disclosure rules. So in that case, it just would not be a SPAC, and it would effectively just be an IPO of the target company. So for that reason, the U.S. rules require, the disclosure rules require that a SPAC cannot have any target company in mind. SPAC sponsors actually need to certify to the SEC and the underwriters during the IPO process that they don't have a target company in mind. But you kind of stumbled upon an important point, which is that there's no fundamental reason why it has to be that way. It's just a kind of function of the way the U.S. disclosure rules operate.
Okay. We have more 10 minutes. I'm going to make a question, and you decided where we respond. Due to the current economic crisis that arose from COVID, several corporations are facing liquidity problems, not only in the U.S. and Europe, but here in Brazil. And I expect that next year we're going to face some problems. So, in some companies still are already in insolvency situation. Are these companies eligible to become a target company in a SPAC? Is this SPAC a possible solution for the liquidity problems that these companies have?
It would be difficult for a SPAC to come in and provide liquidity to a troubled company. Having said that, if a company has been impacted by COVID and you can assess how that impact may play out in the future, and it's still a viable public company, it is possible that you could market around that and create a situation where that company can go public. But if it is a company that is just took a dip, that's one thing. If it's a company that's having challenges from a liquidity or from an operational perspective, probably not necessarily a company that would be received well in the public markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fabiana?
I'll go back to one of the comments that Lee just made about the SPACs are being an investment, which is called a blind pool investment or a blank check company, right? And I wanted to ask and to explore a little bit more the risk involved in these operations because of this blank check company. Does it increase the risk for players and for investors? How do investors see the fact that it is let's put this way, it's an investment in the dark?
Yeah, so for investors in the SPAC IPO, it's really a risk-free investment because of the way the SPAC is structured. 100% of the IPO proceeds go into a trust account, and then the shareholder has the option to redeem their shares in connection with the business combination, or if a business combination doesn't get done. So if you are an IPO investor in a SPAC, you're investing typically $10 for a unit to share in a fraction of the warrant, and that investment is fully downside protected. Worst comes to worst, even if a deal doesn't get done or a deal gets done and the market hates it, that your $10 is available to you for redemption and sitting in a trust account for just that matter. For the SPAC sponsor itself, they are, in order to kind of make the economics work, they are making an upfront capital investment in the SPAC in order to pay for some of the IPO expenses and some of the operating expenses. It's not a huge amount. It's typically 2 to 3% of the size of the IPO, but that is what's referred to as the at-risk capital, and that's what gives the sponsors some skin in the game and the incentive to get a deal done. And then, if all goes according to plan, the SPAC will go out and announce a deal. And at that point, the stock of the SPAC will trade based on kind of the public market's reaction to the deal. It won't, until the deal closes, it won't dip below $10 because of the redemption option. But the hope is that it will actually pop up above $10 to reflect the public market valuation of the combined company. And at that point, it's really no different than any other, IPO company. Investors can choose to invest or not invest based on the current valuation, and take the risk of how the investment will turn out.
Okay.
I'm gonna make a question. It's about Brazil. I don't know if you guys are familiar with our regulation here in Brazil, and so what's your perspective regarding SPACs in Brazil, considering the always challenging balance between risk and investment opportunities in Brazil? Rick, please.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to talk about this, given my lack of knowledge of the Brazilian market. But there is one SPAC that I'm aware of, HPX, that is focused on operations and finding a business in Brazil. And as Lee mentioned, the main point is going to be, is this going to attract U.S. investors? Haven't seen Brazilian investors get into SPACs, but again, I'm not as close to that investor base. But there's no reasons why I say it can't work, and there's no reason why, if there's enough investor appetite in Brazil, that its own community of SPACs could not develop based upon Brazilian investors. They had that in the UK, they had that in Italy, they had that in other countries around the world. So it's really whether the infrastructure, both the professional infrastructure and the investor infrastructure and the company infrastructure is here so that it could develop.
Mm-hmm.
I do some Brazil M&A. Brazil obviously has a lot of attractive assets, whether infrastructure, commodities, more recently certain technologies, including financial technologies, all of which can be viable SPAC candidates. Candidly, I think Brazil, in my experience from a regulatory perspective, is not as friendly as some other jurisdictions, and that there's more local regulatory requirements that need to be complied with, and that may add a little bit of a tax on Brazilian companies looking to access the public markets. It's just a less familiar structure to U.S. investors, and it's not as as efficient in some ways as a U.S. or Cayman, for instance, holding company. But certainly, as Rick said, there are plenty of attractive assets in Brazil, and there's no fundamental reason why those assets cannot be paired with a SPAC. And as you see from HPX, there's at least one SPAC out there that is specifically targeting Brazilian assets. So I expect that over the next 6 to 12 months, if not sooner, we will see SPAC deals done in Brazil, and hopefully that will be a harbinger of more to come.
Mm-hmm.
And with that in mind, I would jump to Tom. Thomas, I wanted to know your opinion about it, since
that's my question.
We'll have, Lee, I didn't want to start with the bankruptcy yet, but Lee was very positive, saying that SPACs is the real perspective in Brazil, and I want to know your opinion about it.
Yeah. Out of the sector that he mentioned, which is the sector, that will take opportunity to use the SPACs? Because the sector that
okay, let's start. Brazil, it's a very large country. We're larger than the US without Alaska. You know, it's a continental country, 210 million people. It's one of the largest economies in the world. You know, we've been not very lucky. Let's say lucky is not the best word. So Brazil's image now is not the best outside. But, you know, in this roller coaster, which I witnessed in all these years, you know, there are moments when things are very bad and then things are very good. And Brazil is always in the middle, you know. So answering your question, you know, from my perspective, I think we have a very sophisticated financial market in Brazil. And we have a very highly sophisticated professional class who handles some very, very interesting transactions. So I think that it is possible in our economic scenario to find targets either for a US SPAC interested in investing in Brazil, or for even a Brazilian SPAC registered here in Brazil, trying to incorporate the US experience here in our market. I was just mentioning, perhaps jokingly, but you know, there is now an issue here of privatizing the post service in Brazil. I won't mention the post service to our American friends because it might be a complicated concept, but it's a company, you know, it's huge, and it has been for the past year. It lost most of the years, you know. I think it did okay 1 or 2 years, but other than that, but the asset base is immense, you know, in the target. So this is something which comes to my mind. Also, there's a lot of infrastructure development, which is extremely interesting, you know. If you take railway companies, which have to expand basically also to serve the crops here which are being exported and so on, and several other, you know, companies, very large companies now, which are being privatized, and which could be the targets. So basically, you know, you're looking here at agribusiness, you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking here at privatizations, public service companies, even large companies which would like, you know, there's a whole line of companies which are waiting to get their IPOs approved. So the SPAC might be not a remedy for all these companies, but it might be the right solution for some of these companies which would like to go the IPO route through the, let's say, taking the measures which Lee has described and which Rick has described. You know, these are all things which are perfectly feasible. So my take is, yes, there is space here in Brazil for SPACs. Just the companies which are waiting in line or which would like to go through an IPO, that might be a solution for them. And also the other large businesses which are related to, as I mentioned, infrastructure, privatization, agribusiness, and so on, which might be interesting targets, both for US SPAC and eventually, if we're able to do it, Brazilian SPACs.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Mr. Fosberg, do you want to make some questions or I mean, some wrap up, or just finish here?
I would like to thank everybody, you know. I would like to thank this wonderful team of Valor, you know, Cristiano and Adriana and Roberta and Lúcio. Really has been a pleasure to work with you. I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed by the professionalism. I would like to thank all our panelists, you know, for this fantastic job, you know, very sophisticated, very interesting. For our moderators, who did this lovely job. But I would also like to thank my partners and all the lawyers in our office which made this event possible, and which are using this opportunity to celebrate our 50th anniversary in a way which is challenging, which is different, not so much to drink or to eat as in other types of celebration, but in pandemic times, this is not just a replacement, it's perhaps a better choice. So thank you all. And I would also like to thank all our viewers for their patience and for participating in our webinar and in this experience. For us, I'm very grateful to all.
Thank you, Mr. Freshberg. I do thank you to bring us this, this new instrument that we will be learning about it, the next months and so on. Fabiana, do you want to speak something?
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you all. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Rick, for the class that we had today. And I have a few more questions for you, but I'll make sure to address it later after this panel regarding a few details with respect to investors' perspective, investors' rights, and the seller's rights as well. In any case, I'll send it out to you, and thank you very much. It was very interesting and very clarifying in terms of this new tool, as Cristiano said, to be used in Brazil.
Prepare yourself, because Fabiana has a lot of questions to make. So thank you so much, Lee and Rick. And I'm going to put the presentations, linked to this event. And I thank you all. Agradeço a todos que assistiram a mais uma live do Valor, um webinar especial. Agradeço muito ao Dr. Thomas Felsberg, a Fabiana, ao Luiz Gustavo, que nos ajudou a fazer essa transmissão, e a todos que assistiram, a Daniela. Muito obrigado a todos. Até a próxima.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Thank you.